Hello everyone, and thank you to the Archaeological Society for inviting me to give this talk. I would like to start by asking you to have a look around the room where you currently are and take a mental inventory of the cloth that is in that room with you. No doubt some of the things on your inventory include the clothes that you're wearing, the upholstery of the couch or chair that you're sitting in, the cushion at your back, the carpet at your feet, the curtains at your window. These are all examples of woven cloth that we are surrounded by today. And from this we can see that we are very much a cloth-rich society. In fact, we are so cloth-rich that some of us can afford to be purchasing and then discarding mountains and mountains of clothing, to the effect that currently fast fashion is regarded as one of the largest environmental threats facing the world today. But this was not always the case. We were not always cloth-rich, and this is in large part due to the fact that until the beginnings of the industrial production of cloth in the second half of the 18th century, cloth production very much relied on a laborious and very labor-intensive process that involved growing or gathering or rearing, in the case of animal fibres, the raw material for cloth, then processing it into continuous or semi-continuous fibres, and then weaving it by hand again into cloth. As such, the production and use of textiles is a very important and basic part of human history, and has thus fascinated archaeologists for years, including those in Africa. As I'm sure many of you know, cloth production, particularly weaving, has long been celebrated as one of West Africa's foremost crafts and sites of artistic production. As such, it has been the subject of numerous coffee table books, art and cultural history museum exhibitions, and academic research. Much of this cloth is made with that most familiar of fibres to us, cotton, but West Africa also has a very rich tradition of using a wide variety of fibres, including raffia, wool, silk, bast, and cotton, or in fact any combination of these in their cloth. Unfortunately, however, due to the environmental conditions that mitigate against the preservation of these textiles archaeologically, we managed to get only fairly rare glimpses into the finished product of the cloth. In fact, there are probably no more than about 15 instances throughout West Africa where archaeologists have recovered fragments of bast, cotton, wool, raffia, or other textiles. Perhaps one of the most well-known and richest of these textile finds are those from the burial caves of the Telem in Mali, where over 500 textiles were recovered, including both cotton garments and wool blankets. The earliest cotton garments date back to between the 11th and 12th century and were strip woven, illustrating the longevity of this tradition of textile manufacture in West Africa. So apart from the rare finds of archaeological textiles, the most prevalent form of archaeological evidence for textile manufacture rests with the spindle whorls that are recovered at numerous sites in West Africa. Spindle whorls are a very basic but yet enduring tool, first invented by humans about 8,000 years ago in some parts of the world. They only appear, however, in West Africa at about 800 AD, at sites along the arc associated with the early advent of the trans-Saharan trade in the second half of the first millennium. They are found in increasing numbers from the 11th century onwards, including at sites such as Dia in Mali, where they also recovered large numbers of cotton seeds, and then throughout West Africa at increasing numbers of sites, albeit only in small numbers. Based on this pattern, it is thus likely that spindle whorls and the practice of spinning with a spindle was likely introduced via the trans-Saharan trade and then further dispersed throughout West Africa via regional trade routes. It is also mostly agreed on by scholars that it was at this time that cotton became more widely cultivated and the fibre of choice for cloth production in sub-Saharan West Africa. Before I proceed, however, perhaps it's worth asking, what is a spindle whorl? A spindle whorl is essentially a weight at the end of a spindle, which adds impetus to the spin introduced by a spinner, introducing twist into unspun fibre. Now, it is possible to produce spun fibre without a spindle whorl or spindle, but it is far more efficient to use this tool than to do it by hand or simply with a stick, which is why it is used. Now, not all fibres need to be spun, so bast fibres, for example, can very easily be rolled or tied together by hand and then used to make cloth. But when we are looking at fibres such as particularly the short-stapled fibre of African cotton, some wool, as well as African silk, we really need a spindle in order to produce fibre at a reliable level of production so that you can then use it in cloth. Spindles are made up of two parts, so you've got the spindle whorl, which could be anywhere along the shaft. So in this instance it's at the bottom. Sometimes you find spindle whorls at the top of the shaft or in the middle. It depends both on regional practice as well as the kind of whorl that you have and the preference of the spinner. As the spun thread is produced, it's wound around the shaft, thus producing the cob, or sometimes it's also referred to as the cop, and the direction of the spin, so clockwise, which would be away from the spinner, or anti-clockwise towards the spinner, determines whether or not a thread is regarded as being Z-spun or S-spun. And if the thread is going to be plied, so plying is when two or more threads are then spun together, that is usually done in the opposite direction to which it is spun, but not always, if we look at some examples of archaeological textiles. So when spinning, the spinner will draw out the unspun fibre, and then holding it at the point between where it goes from spun to unspun, they'll rotate the spindle, and when enough twist has built up in what is known as the leader thread, they will release their fingers, and that twist will then travel up into the unspun fibre. From there, the fibre can then be further manipulated to smooth out any slubs, and then it is wound on to the spindle, forming the cob, and the whole process starts again. And the spinner will just continue to do this until they've reached the desired yardage, or until the spindle is full, at which point they'll wind it off and then start again or switch to another spindle. In order to put the question of yardage into perspective, we can look at a practical example. So this woman's wrapper was purchased in Egan in Nigeria in 1841 by members of the Niger expedition. And Colleen Krieger, who has examined this textile in person, estimates that it's approximately 96 centimeters by 203 centimeters, and it was likely used as a woman's wrapper. Further, she was also able to determine what the set of the textile was. So namely that the warp was set at 15 ends per centimeter, and that the weft, it was woven at approximately 10 picks per centimeter. So these measurements allowed us to work out how much thread was needed in order to weave this piece of cloth. And you can see the calculations on the screen. So essentially, before the weaver even set out to begin weaving this piece of cloth, or the components that were joined together to make it, they needed almost 5 kilometers of thread, spun at thickness roughly equivalent to an industrial 10-2 cotton, such as that used for tea towels. And Krieger notes as well that Z-spun yarns were used in these cloths, implying that the spindle was turned away from the spinner during the spinning. As you can imagine, using the process which I previously described, It takes a lot of labor on the part of the spinner to produce the amount of yarn or thread needed for one woman's wrapper. So imagine now the amount of time taken by West African spinners to produce enough yarn for all of the cloth that we know was being produced, at least in the last 500 years and probably prior to that. Despite the fact that African spinners were clearly crucial to the maintenance of a burgeoning and productive cloth industry, spinners are often not extensively discussed in the literature, as most scholars tend to focus on the finished product rather than the techniques and the work taken to get to the finished product. In studies of West African weaving, therefore, spinning is often mentioned as a subsidiary task. Possibly there are a few photographs of spinners and a brief explanation of the process, but little beyond that. Despite the fact that spindle whorls were a common find at second millennium sites in West Africa, archaeologists too do not pay much attention to this craft. There are a couple of people who have approached it from an ethno-archaeological perspective, such as Paul Lane in Mali and Lucy Smolderin, who has an ongoing project currently in Benin. However, spindle whorls are usually noted merely as a proxy line of evidence for cloth production, and then are not discussed further in any great detail. This lack of attention is perhaps due to the fact that spindle whorls are often recovered only in fairly small quantities from these sites, and thus, many archaeologists may feel they can only say so much about 5 or 10 or 15 artifacts when they have a lot of other material that they also need to work through. This is also due to the fact that when an archaeologist is focused on reporting on finds from the site where they are currently working on, they are focused on the importance of that site and its immediate vicinity, not necessarily from a regional perspective of West Africa as a whole. An important part of my project, therefore, is to expand our understanding of African spinning from that regional perspective. An important goal of my project, therefore, is to expand our understanding of spinning from a regional perspective. What was the role within West Africa of spinning in terms of its social and economic importance? And what can we tell about the technologies and techniques used by West African spinners in order to create the basic material that was then used in cloth making? And so I've thus identified 2 main research questions, which I'll be focusing on tonight. Firstly, is there a regional style of West African spinning? And growing from this, what is in the West African spinner's toolkit? What is the archaeological visibility of those aspects of West African spinner's toolkit? In terms of addressing this issue, I've identified 2 main research questions that I'll be discussing tonight. First, is there a regional style of West African spinning? And if there is a regional style, what is in the West African spinner's toolkit? And an addendum to this issue is, are any of those tools in the toolkit archaeologically visible? One of the issues that we face in terms of pursuing a textile archaeology in Africa is that many archaeologists are not familiar with what goes into textile production in spinning or weaving. So we might not necessarily recognize these things archaeologically when we see them. So this is one of the things that we can address by looking in depth at a craft like spinning. And then secondly, what is the social and economic importance of West African spinning? What can we say? Now, unfortunately, when it comes to answering these questions, we are hampered by the fact that there are very few contemporary representations of fibercraft, spinning, weaving, with the early years of spindle whorls in West Africa. So if you look at other world areas, so for example Egypt or Greece, you have contemporary artwork that depicts how people use their tools and what tools they were using. In West Africa, even when, for example, early Arabic writers, even when they discuss what people were wearing, they don't go into a great amount of detail about how cloth was made. And therefore, it's very difficult to use these contemporary sources to shed light on how spindle wheels were used during the first half of the second millennium in West Africa. So I've therefore decided to start at the other end of the chronological scale, with the more recent past, to see what we can learn that we can perhaps then push back into further into the past. I've thus begun a survey of source materials, text and documentary sources, pictorial, photographic sources, and video in various locations. But in a large part, this has been facilitated by the fact that so much material is now available on the internet. So, for example, sites such as archive.org or the Smithsonian have published electronic versions of many travel accounts, colonial reports, missionary documents. You've got ethnographies largely written in the 20th century, which might touch on aspects of textile production and archaeology dissertations. So many times students, when they find spindle wheels on their sites, they report them in their dissertations, and then if there's an active spinner in their community, they will include a photograph and a description of how that spinner works. Then in addition, you've got the illustrations, figures or photographs featured in documentary sources, online photographic databases, online museum collections, and then also photo sharing sites such as Flickr and Pinterest, which many, for example, tourists and travelers will take photographs of spinners in the communities that they visit, and then these will be uploaded and can be sought for with search terms. And then sites such as Flickr, YouTube, and Vimeo also sometimes include videos of spinners at their work. So the outcome of this to date has been a collection of over 100 observations of spinners working. And I use the term observation here because essentially each of these dots represents a photograph or a description of usually a specific spinner at work. Sometimes particularly travel writers from the 18th and 19th century, they'll make generic comments such as this is how they spin, but the sense that you get from those descriptions is that they have watched at least one or more spinners, and then they are just projecting that to the society as a whole. As you can see from this map, most of the sources date from the 18 and 1900s, but the two oldest come from the second half of the 18th century, and the most recent come from in the last 5 years. The rest of my talk tonight will deal with what these collected observations can tell us about the research questions that I posed earlier. So when it comes to the first research question, is there a regional style of spinning in West Africa? The answer is most definitely yes. So in fact, based on the observations that I've worked through, there are two types of spinning that are recorded. So the first is drop spinning, which account for probably approximately 10% of the observations. And the second is supported spinning, which takes up the bulk at about 90% of the time. When people are observed spinning, they are spinning supported. In drop spinning, the spindle is spun suspended. The spinner rotates the spindle and then drops it while drafting the fibre with both hands. It can be done standing or seated, or perhaps even while you're walking. With cotton, it should be borne in mind that the spindle must be light enough so that the half-spun thread can support both the weight of the spindle and the growing cob. In supported spinning, the spindle is rotated on a surface and the fibre is spun from the tip. The spinner is usually seated on the ground or on a chair with a table alongside. There must be a spinning surface, and the At times, though, the spindle may be semi-suspended, so occasionally the spinner may lift it up or may drop it from a height to the surface on which it will spin. But for the most part, the weight of the spindle rests on the surface, and thus weight is less of an issue because the surface bears the weight of the spindle and the cob, not the thread that is being spun. So as I've said, drop spinning constitutes probably less than 10% of the observations currently. One example is from Laird Oldfield in 1837, who remarked that the cotton is spun by everyone, from the king downwards, upon what I believe is called a falling bobbin. The spinner carries a quantity of raw cotton in his hand, and with his finger and thumb commences the thread, the end of which he fastens to the bobbin, giving it a rotary motion, and lets it fall, paying out the cotton with great quickness and dexterity. This is repeated until the bobbin reaches the ground, when the thread is wound up and he begins again. I frequently met slaves carrying large burdens on their heads, spinning in this manner as they walked. And in fact, there are photographs from the 20th century in Nigeria, which also show women with baskets on their head drop spinning as they walk. So as I said previously, supported spinning, which occurred approximately 90% of the time, takes place with the spinner seated either on the ground or on a chair. And this style of spinning is really remarkably consistent throughout West Africa. It transcends ethno-linguistic boundaries and is remarkably consistent over time as well. So this photograph, which was taken in the 20th century, this past decade, shows the spinner spinning in a very similar way to the spinner who was drawn in 1821 in the Senegambia. So as you will see that there are some slight variations in terms of how spinners sit, where their legs are in relation to the spindle. Much of this is perhaps due to personal preference as well as some regional variability. Spinning is actually quite hard on the body, and obviously each spinner will find what works for them best physically in terms of sitting and holding the spindle that will allow them to spin for a long period of time. So not only do we have this recorded in a pictorial way in photographs and drawings, but also in the written accounts of travellers. So Winterbottom, who was writing about Sierra Leone in the early 19th century, notes this habit of spinning with a spindle wheel in a large shell or wooden dish. And Temple in the 1920s in Nigeria, again, the stick is spun in a basket filled with pieces of leather. This observation that supported spinning is the most prevalent form of spinning in West Africa really lends understanding to why the spindle wheels that are found are most often these kinds of bead-type wheels, conical, biconical in shape, sometimes spherical. The degree to which they are decorated might vary over time and space. But this is a very different kind of wheel to, say, for example, a disc-type wheel, which is also sometimes found, but not as often as the bead-type wheel. So these kinds of repurposed potsherd wheels, so often they'll also be smoothed around the edge. This one appears to have perhaps been only half made, are often found, most often, for example, on southern African sites. And they are found in West Africa, but not as often as we do the spherical wheels. But this may in part be due to the fact that we are missing a crucial part of the archaeological record. So these are drop spindles collected by John Picton during his work on textiles in Nigeria, and they show the use of other kinds of materials to produce disc-type wheels. So you've got wood, calabash, and a seed pod, which was also used as a spindle wheel. Now, these were all drop spindles. You can tell that because when you look at the end of the shaft below the wheel, they are not tipped. So a supported spinning spindle will always have to have a tip that is capable of being twirled on a surface, whereas with drop spindles, that is not needed. In addition, although the one at the bottom, the one with the seed pod, has got a very smooth spindle shaft, the top two you can see are a little bit rough. And this is actually also a desirable quality in a drop spindle, because that means that it gives more purchase to the thread when it is dropped. So often, for example, with drop spindles, you actually have to do a half hitch knot so that you don't simply, so that the spun thread, the leader thread, has some purchase on the spindle when you drop it. The other difference between drop spinning and supported spinning is the weight. So, for example, with the drop spindle, as I said previously, the drop spindle has to be fairly light because the thread, as it is being spun, needs to support the weight of the spindle as well as the growing cob that is on the spindle. And so it really helps if you start off with a spindle that is very light. So, for example, something with a calabash or a seed pod or something wooden. Whereas with the supported spindle, this is not an issue at all because the thread never has to bear the weight of the spindle and the cob. And so this is a full spindle that was also collected or purchased by the members of the Niger expedition in 1841 in Nigeria. The spindle shaft would have originally been longer, but you can see how full this is. So you would not, for example, be able to drop spin with this amount of thread wound onto the spindle. And this is not you might suspect that this perhaps is in actual fact a bobbin, but possibly it has a thread from more than one full spindle on it. But if you look on some of the YouTube videos of spinners in Burkina Faso today, they do in fact have spindles that are this full that they are still spinning with. So in a way, supported spinning then also means that you can perhaps spin for longer without having to change your spindle or wind off, so that in order to accommodate the weight of the spindle. We can now come to my subsidiary question, to what was in the spinner's toolkit. So the best way to think about this is in terms of the processes that move raw cotton to woven cloth. So cotton needs to be grown and harvested, and then it comes in the form of a boll. So basically the seed pod will open and this is what is picked, and then you can just pull the cotton from there. But this then needs to be ginned before it can be spun. So ginning is really the word used for the seed removal of cotton. Then the fibres need to be bowed, which is a way of fluffing them up. It introduces air into them, separates the fibres out, makes them easier to spin. Then the fibre is spun. Then we move into what I'm terming thread management. So, for example, once your spindle is full, do you move on to another spindle? Do you wind it off so that you can use the same spindle again? It may be up to the individual spinner. It may depend on how many spindles they have on hand. So once the spindle is full, it can be handled in two ways. So first of all, it can be wound off onto a bobbin, which will hold the spun thread from many spindles, or it can be wound into a skein. And so what I've gathered from the reading and the work that I've been doing is that usually skeins are produced when they are going to be dyed. So, for example, if you want to make a striped textile, alternating indigo blue with plain thread, you then, in the warp, you need to have both blue and white threads. And so you may order from a spinner, or the spinner may want to, who is intent on producing her own cloth, she'll turn it into a skein, which then goes to the dyers. The skein is dyed and will then go to the weavers. Alternately, it can be put on a bobbin. The bobbin can be taken to the weaver, who will then use it to prepare the warp and to load the shuttles for weaving. And then the woven cloth might at the end go for dyeing, if the whole cloth is to be dyed, including the introduction of patterns. So ginning was largely done either by hand, so people would need to go through the cotton ball and pick the seeds out by hand, or by rolling on a stone with an iron rod. And both of these methods are not regionally specific, or not specific to times and places. They are fairly evenly scattered throughout West Africa. So this is an example of a cotton bow, currently with the British Museum, also part of the John Picton collection from Nigeria. And here is included as well a piece of worked bone that was used for perhaps thrumming the bow. So spinning is the time when the largest number of tools and processes come together. So if we look collectively at all of the observations of spinners over the last couple of hundred years, you'll see that they'll have a distaff or not. So again, this is not something that is, say, sub-regionally specific to certain parts of West Africa. It may well be up to the specific preference of the spinner, or just whether or not they happen to have the tool on hand. You have the spindle, which, as I said previously, is made up of the shaft and the spindle wheel. You have a container with supplies. So this would be a basket, a calabash, or a pot. Calabash is depicted here. And this will hold the spinner's tools when she is not actively spinning, as well as the unspun fibre. Then you usually have a container with white powder. And different observers give different explanations of what this powder is. And it's not entirely clear if it is because spinners in different places were using different kinds of powders, or if it was just the interpretation that the observer put on the powder, or what they were told by the people concerned. So, but the kinds that are listed are ash, millet flour, or a white clay. And usually the explanation given for the use of this powder is that the spinner would use it to dry her fingers, so in order not to dirty the spun fibre as it passes through her fingers. So lastly, we have the spinning surface. This is again composed of a variety of materials. So there might be pieces of leather, which may be as well overlain in a calabash or a pot, might be a potsherd, a piece of cloth, a calabash sherd, or a stone. Those are the ones that have been mentioned thus far. Also, presumably, it was possible to simply spin on the compound floor, for example, but clearly spinners like to have particular kinds of surfaces that they use to spin. And also more recently, I should add, in the second half of the 20th and the 21st century, people will use pieces of hard plastic as well. And as I've said before, really there's a lot of longevity in these tools that we use. So if we look at our spinner from Burkina Faso, she has exactly the same set of elements as in the spinner from 1821. She has her work basket with the unspun fibre, she has a distaff, she has her spindle wheel, and she has her container with ash. So really we should be looking for, hints of these things in the archaeological record where preservation permits. Then we have thread management. So as I said, you can have a simple skein winder. So again, a variety of instruments are used here. So for example, you might just simply put 2 rods, either metal or wood, in the ground and bind your skein around that, or on a simple niddy-noddy made of wood with that shape. Alternately, if you wind it onto a bobbin, multiple spindles worth of cotton wound off onto a single large bobbin, which is usually a longer stick than that used for a spindle or a distaff, and you might add a lump of clay or soil to stop the thread from slipping off the end. And so sometimes if you look at pictures of weavers, you'll see next to them a large bobbin sitting on hand, ready to be wound onto the spools used in the shuttles that they use in weaving. So this brings us to the question of, is spinning in West Africa archaeologically visible beyond the obvious of the spindle wheel? So to my mind, there are at least a couple more artifacts that we should be looking for archaeologically. These are the ginning stones, possibly if a ceramic container is used to hold the ash or the clay or similar, potsherds or stones used to spin on, and obviously the ceramic whorls. Now, the interpretation on some of these would obviously depend on their being found in association with spindle whorls, but it's really something to think about, and I would encourage archaeologists working in this area to perhaps cast their minds over the finds that they've made at these sites to see if anything falls into these categories. In addition, depending on the preservation at the particular site, you've got cotton seeds, a ginning bar, which if metal, so in some cases metal doesn't preserve well, but in others it may well, as well as the worked bone that may have accompanied the use of the bow. Then, of course, we have a set of artifacts that will not survive unless there is exceptional preservation for some reason. And these are things such as the bow, the distaff, the spindle shaft, whorls made from perishable materials, the leather cloth or calabash, spinning surface, and obviously the raw spun cotton. However, this does not mean that we should not bear these things in mind when interpreting the other finds that we have. Before I close, I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about the social and economic importance of West African spinning. So, no lesser archaeologist than Leonard Woolley once wrote in one of his site reports for the Near East that if I devote a special section of my text to spindle whorls, I do so with apologies. My object is simply to clear the ground as expeditiously as possible of a mass of material of no great interest, which would otherwise obtrude unduly. There is no excuse for wasting space and money on this monotonous and profitless material. Now, I would have to say that I disagree with Leonard Woolley. I think that there's a lot that we can learn by paying more attention to these smaller kinds of artifacts and thinking about them in the context of the societies that we are studying. So we know that from at least the 16th century onward, if not before, cotton cloth was being traded in the interior of West Africa as well as on the coast after the advent of the European trade, in quantities of hundreds and thousands of pieces. In some areas, cloth was being used as a currency and a unit of account. And this trade depended ultimately on the labor of spinners. So who were the spinners? I think we can fairly confidently say that, by and large, women were the habitual spinners, although men could and did spin when needed. So in the instances where men are remarked upon as spinning, often this is because they were weavers themselves, they were in the family of weavers, they were assisting their female relatives, or they had a lot of time on their hands. So, for example, there was one night watchman who would spend his night spinning. In order to reach this rate of production, spinning should be regarded as a ubiquitous, everyday activity. So it wasn't something that you necessarily got up at 8 o'clock in the morning and then worked on until 4 or 5 in the evening. Rather, it was an activity that could easily fit around other tasks during the day. So you could be looking after children, you could be doing the food, you could go to the farm, and then when you had 20 minutes, half an hour, you could sit and spin. It was highly portable. So, for example, if you took things to the market to sell, you could still sit there and spin. You could go and visit your friend and spin. If you went to your farm, you could take your spindle and unspun cotton with you. It was regarded as a high status or low status activity depending on the society in which it was taking place. So in some instances, European observers would state that it was something that the slaves were engaged with, and it was expected of slaves to spin. In other cases, they might say that the lady of the house, in fact, relegated the other household tasks to the slaves so that she could focus on spinning. So again, this is one of these contextual things that might vary from society to society, town to town. It was, however, likely one of the tasks that members of the enslaved population occupied themselves with in those societies that held slaves. And importantly as well, it wasn't a solitary activity. It provided opportunities for socialization between spinners. And I'd like to draw your attention to this description by Mungo Park, who was in Senegal in the late 1700s. And he had basically wandered into a village and begged a meal and a place to sleep for the night from an elderly woman who he had actually interrupted at her spinning. She had been sitting in her doorway spinning. And then later that night, she pointed him to where he might sleep. And then, as he says, called to the female part of her family, who had stood gazing on me all the while in fixed astonishment, to resume their task of spinning cotton, in which they continued to employ themselves for a great part of the night. They lightened their labour by songs, one of which was composed extempore, for I myself was the subject of it. It was sung by one of the young women, the rest joining in a sort of chorus. And that kind of description is very common, that women were observed spinning while selling at the market, in their courtyards, sitting in their doorways, socializing with their neighbors at various times during the day, and then also sitting at night with the men in the compound, joining in the discussions. So in terms of the way forward for this project, particularly the aspect of it that focuses on spinning, I plan to continue the documentary and pictorial survey, so I do expect to add even more observations as I come across more sources. In addition, I'm in the process of drawing up a spindle whorls database and a rough typology, because one of the issues that we face in archaeology is that spindle whorls are often not adequately described. So, for example, many archaeologists do not weigh the spindle whorls, and will quite happily say, oh, they're all light, but we don't really have quantitative analysis to back that up. And then in addition, I see that there's a need for experimental archaeology and useware analysis, and I'll also be working on those aspects. So thank you very much, and please feel free to post any questions in the chat or the comments, and I'll make a point to answer them if I can. Thank you.